teach you to think more like a philosopher. We're going to look at a Steven Pinker paragraph for an example. I'm Elliot Temple. My philosophy, Critical Fallibilism, has original ideas that I developed over the last 20 years. I've come up with solutions to some otherwise unsolved problems, and I'm trying to teach these to other people. It is related to some other thinkers' work, like Karl Popper, Ayn Rand, and Eli Goldratt. My approach emphasizes error correction, reaching decisive conclusions, and focus. It rejects argument strengths. For example, if you've ever said that's a weak argument or a strong argument, or the same thing with evidence, I think you've made a philosophical error that is extremely widespread. Why is critical fallibilism good? Why do I think I'm right or have important ideas? I've talked about that elsewhere. Here you can watch what I have to say and judge for yourself. Also, if you think I'm wrong about something, I am open to debate at my forum. So we're going to look at a paragraph by Steven Pinker in the book Possible Minds. I noticed something odd about the cover. It has these triangles that underline words. But 3 of the triangles are missing one part. So it's missing this line here, and this line here. And I could not figure out why. I couldn't find a pattern to why those 3 lines are missing. It might just be an error. This is not very important, but it's an example of paying attention to details, which a lot of people are not very detail-oriented. If you want to be good at philosophy, being detail-oriented is important. If you're trying to figure out which ideas are good, or debate things, the person who is better at paying attention to details has a major advantage, because details can often affect what the right answer is. Not all details are important, though. People sometimes get a reputation as being pedantic or hair-splitting, and good philosophy finds important details. Like, you have to be detail-oriented to look at the details and then figure out which of them actually matter and then bring those up. This one does not particularly matter. I did bring it up, but I also admitted it wasn't important. I didn't say, oh, look, the book is terrible, I found an error in it. It's just a minor oddity. So here's the paragraph we're going to be talking about. It's in the book Possible Minds, and the essay by Pinker is called Tech Prophecy and the Underappreciated Causal Power of Ideas. The paragraph says, artificial intelligence is an existence proof of one of the great ideas in human history, that the abstract realm of knowledge, reason, and purpose does not consist of an elan vital or immaterial soul or miraculous powers of neural tissue. Rather, it can be linked to the physical realm of animals and machines via the concepts of information, computation, and control. Knowledge can be explained as patterns in matter or energy that stand in systematic relations with states of the world, with mathematical and logical truths, and with one another. Reasoning can be explained as transformations of that knowledge by physical operations that are designed to preserve those relations. Purpose can be explained as the control of operations to effect changes in the world, guided by discrepancies between its current state and a goal state. Naturally evolved brains are just the most familiar systems that achieve intelligence through information, computation, and control. Humanly designed systems that achieve intelligence vindicate the notion that information processing is sufficient to explain it. The notion that the late Jerry Fodor dubbed the computational theory of mind. I decided to start briefly with some of my conclusions, and then we'll go through how to get there step by step. So here is a summary of the 7 sentences in the paragraph. AI is proof there is no soul. The abstract realm can be linked to the physical realm. Knowledge is physical patterns. Reasoning is designed physical transformations. Purpose is guided physical control. Brains are just familiar. AI vindicates the computational theory of mind. And here is Pinker's main argument. We built intelligent machines, Therefore, souls aren't necessary for intelligence. Therefore, nothing has a soul. There are 4 unstated assumptions here. You could probably come up with more, but I think these are major. So he assumed there's one type of intelligence only, and obviously machines don't have souls, and the only purpose of a soul would be to enable intelligence, and due to Occam's razor, we shouldn't believe in anything unnecessary. If you add in these 4 assumptions, the argument makes reasonable sense and follows a logical progression. Most people, if they read the paragraph, would have trouble summarizing it and figuring out the main argument and finding hidden assumptions. So how do you get from reading a paragraph to actually doing philosophical analysis and reaching conclusions? I want to teach people how to do their own analysis. The Pinker paragraph is just an example. My main focus or priority is on breaking things down into parts that you can work on. So you can learn each thing individually, practice it individually, instead of being overwhelmed by how do you deal with this entire paragraph all at once. There are smaller steps that are more accessible and approachable. One of the things philosophers tend to do more than other people is ask big, deep, or basic questions. They're more willing to start at the beginning or look at the bigger picture. So it's in line with the ethos of philosophy to wonder, how does reading work? We're trying to read a paragraph and understand something about it, so we need to know something about reading. People mostly read by intuition. They have habits from childhood. They learned how to read in the past, and they're just repeating what they did before. When you rely on habit and intuition, then it is difficult to do philosophical analysis. Philosophy involves explicit steps, doing things consciously, putting things into words, being able to write things down or say them out loud, rather than relying on gut feelings and that kind of thing. So we're going to analyze sentences. They have 2 parts, content, also called meaning, and grammar, also called structure. We're going to skip over reading letters, syllables, and words. Those are all important, but you're probably already good enough at that. People's childhood ability to read a letter is good enough, not usually a source of philosophical errors and debate, whereas people's ability to read a sentence is more problematic. People reading sentences differently actually leads to debates which can be difficult to solve. Also, pronunciation is not important to philosophy. So when you're reading, you generally focus on grammar first before content. That's because the content can be anything, it's more variable, whereas grammar follows consistent rules and patterns. The grammar is easier, simpler, and more straightforward, and then understanding the grammar helps you with the harder part, figuring out the content. If you want to analyze grammar in a conscious way, instead of relying on your subconscious, then diagrams are helpful. I'll be teaching a type of diagram called dependency grammar trees. These let you write out on a piece of paper or on a computer screen what your grammar analysis is, and it lets you then review it, reread it, and think it over, and make edits to it. And it's easier to do that when you got something out of your head, instead of trying to just think about it in your head and then change your mind in your head, and it's all going on in your head. That's harder. Getting things outside of yourself, externally, can make them more objective and easier to think about. The grammar information that will be in the diagrams is all stuff that you should understand from reading. It shouldn't be new information or particularly insightful. If it gives you insight, that means that your reading habits were missing something. They were leaving something out. They were not giving you as much insight as they ideally would. That's very common, so you can use diagrams to help bridge that gap and get more insight. And then if you practice with diagrams for a while, you'll get more used to it and your habitual reading will improve, so that you can skip the diagrams and still do better than you did before. Some of what you learn from the diagrams can become automatic in your mind. Grammar diagrams are only a starting point for philosophical analysis. They're not the whole thing. They're relatively basic, and they're one of the things that you need to be good at. But there's a bunch of more advanced things to also learn later. Grammar diagrams are basically the most basic starting point that a lot of people are bad at, or at least one of them. Another one is arithmetic, which is pretty important, and also a lot of people are pretty bad at it. So there are 3 main types of grammar diagrams: dependency, constituency, and Reed-Kellogg, also called sentence diagramming, which is the one that is most commonly taught in school, but it's also the worst one. Both of the tree diagrams are elegant, and they follow a single simple rule for how you construct the tree. You also have to know grammar, but the tree construction part has one rule. And so they're both good in a significant way. They're both worth learning. They're both useful. I will focus on dependency trees because they're simpler and I find them more useful. But constituency trees also have value. Sentence diagrams, on the other hand, are more like a collection of special cases and arbitrary rules. They do not follow clear, elegant patterns. If you use conjunctions and prepositions and stuff, they get messier than the example I've given. There are multiple ways to do the trees. Part of it is just a diagram style decision. So for example, in the constituency tree, we could leave out these 5 nodes. A word or a box in a tree is called a node. These are optional, but they're commonly included, so I included them. And the way you have the words all at the bottom can be done with a dependency tree too, but I don't particularly like it that way. Okay, so what are the main ideas? In a dependency tree, you figure out which words depend on other words. Where is there a dependency relationship? What is the parent and what is the child? What word governs some other word? And there are grammatical tests for this, where you can more precisely figure out which word should be above which other word, and which words should be linked together. So the short answer is that the more important words go higher up in the tree and are the parents of the less important words. So we have the verb at the top, and then we have its nouns, and then its nouns have their modifiers. Constituency has a different approach. Constituency means grouping. So a sentence is a group which consists of a noun phrase, the subject, and a verb phrase, the predicate. And then the noun phrase, which is the subject, consists of a determiner and a noun. And then the determiner is the, and the noun is tiger. And on the other side, we again have groupings. So the verb phrase consists of a verb and a noun phrase, and the noun phrase consists of an adjective and a noun. So there are a few notable differences. Constituency trees have more nodes in them. You can put more nodes in a dependency tree than I have here. But constituency trees have grouping nodes, like this one here represents a group and has things under it. So you got extra nodes that are a little bit more work. Another important thing is the relationships between things are different. So we have the tiger, with tiger being the parent of the. But in the constituency tree, tiger and the are equal. They're equal here, and they're in the same group. So they are members of the same group, so they are siblings rather than parent and child. Similarly, the subject and the predicate are siblings in a constituency tree, whereas in a dependency tree, the verb has priority. The constituency avoids some of the priority decisions. You don't need to learn constituency trees, but if you get really into this stuff, you might want to look into them later. Whereas the sentence diagrams, I would recommend skipping entirely. I don't think they add value. So we'll do dependency trees. If you don't know anything about them or you don't know parts of speech, you should look at some of my previous videos and also my article about grammar. So we'll begin analyzing the paragraph by making sentence trees for each sentence. I'm only going to go into limited detail on how to make the tree because I've covered that in other videos. So here's the tree of the first sentence. It's pretty big, pretty complicated. It wasn't really that bad to make though. I've done worse. It only has 3 conjunctions in it, and only one of them is a clause conjunction. Generally, the more clause conjunctions, the harder it is to deal with the sentence. I'll cover the main points though. So, main verb is you want to look for conjunctions and verbs first. They determine the main structure of the sentence. They're the most important things. We have the is and we have the that does consist. The other conjunctions are actually less important because they're only phrase conjunctions. They're grouping together phrases rather than clauses, so they're not as big a deal. The trees help us see the structure. We've got this group here, then everything else is nested off as one of. And then we can see there's a big group here from this other of. And then there's a big group with the that. Then the does consist is a big group for the subject. There's a bunch of modifiers for the word realm. The single word realm has all of this stuff modifying it. And then also the does consist has an of, and it has this whole thing as the prepositional object group for the of. So the tree helps you see what the groupings of words are and how much information there is in different parts. And very importantly, what modifies what. So this part here does not modify this word intelligence here. Intelligence is not one of the ancestors. You can go up the tree step by step by step by step by step by step by step, and you get to the top and you never run into intelligence. Intelligence is not its parent or its grandparent or its great-grandparent. So it is not telling you about intelligence. So this stuff tells us about the of, which tells us about the does consist, which is important to the that, which is modifying the one, which goes with the of, which is telling us about proof. And then the proof is the complement for the is. So there are relationships connecting things word by word by word up to the top, but only up the tree, not down the tree. You cannot get from this group over to this the here, or over to this ideas here, in addition to not being able to get to intelligence. Okay, so you gotta go through and make trees for all the sentences that you're analyzing. If you have enough practice, you might be able to skip this, but in the beginning, you want to practice it. Until it is easy for you, you should be doing it. You don't have to do it every time, because it can take a while and you might want to skip it and try to do it without it sometimes. But you should be practicing it on a regular basis unless you're really good at it. That is, if you want to think like a philosopher and be able to analyze things. It is very important not to make any mistakes when you read the sentence and you misunderstand what modifies what or how the structure works. If you're reading things incorrectly, that's going to lead to a lot of trouble for your philosophy. So here, the main idea is it can be linked, and you have to figure out what it is, which we'll deal with later. And then there are two big modifier groups. There's the to and the via. And each one has a bunch of extra subsidiary information. The trees can help you figure out the core ideas, like we have knowledge can be explained. That already sounds like a sentence. That could be a sentence. And then there's additional detail. So it can be explained as patterns. Now we're adding a couple more words. And then we have these details telling us what type of patterns. Then we have these other details telling us an additional fact about the patterns. They stand in relations with these other things. This whole thing right here that I'm circling is giving us more information about the relations, telling us what type of relations they are, specifically that they are with the following things. When you get familiar with trees, you can read sentences from trees and find that intuitive instead of weird. And you can skip parts. You can focus on some subtrees and not others. It helps you navigate the sentence in a different way. Like we could read it without this part, and we'd still have a reasonable sentence, we'd just be missing a modifier. Or we could read it without this part. Read again, we've got a sentence that's missing some modification, some extra details. You can look at the sentences and see at a glance, this one's kind of tall. It has a long chain of things to get down to the bottom. There are many layers to the sentence. In other words, there's a lot of nesting. Some sentences are more flat. There are fewer details nested under details nested under details. When a sentence has a lot of nesting, when it's tall, it tends to be harder to read. It tends to be harder to figure out what is a modifier for what, because there's many different modifiers being chained together. And it's not always consecutive. Sometimes a modifier applies to something that is not adjacent to it. Trees also let you see groups. Like we have and. This is an and group. It is information, computation, and control. So the word and is serving to group together the three things, and then the entire group is acting as a single thing. It is through this group. So it is easier to see that through applies to the entire group when you make the tree, and the group that it applies to is a literal subtree. You can understand it from the regular sentence. We're pretty used to small groups with the word and, but the tree makes it easier to see, which is especially helpful when the sentence is a lot more complicated. Trees are also great when you have an argument with someone. When you're reading a sentence differently, or having a lot of misunderstandings or something, you can both make a tree, and then you can compare the trees and see if they're the same or different. It can help you identify disagreements. That's particularly useful when a sentence is ambiguous. Like, if you think it's ambiguous and the other person doesn't see the ambiguity, what you can do is make two different trees and say it could mean this or it could mean this. So it is ambiguous because there's more than one tree for the sentence. And the trees have some sort of important difference, like a modifier having a different parent. And the other person can say which of the trees is the way that they were reading it, or which is the one that they meant. This tree is on the more complicated side because of the dash. The dash is basically resulting in two sentences worth of information being jammed into one sentence. Pinker also did that with the first sentence of the paragraph using a colon. Dashes, colons, and semicolons are all ways to fit more stuff into a sentence. You end up with extra complicated sentences. We'll come back to the grammar trees, but first I want to show what you can do next, which is making a paragraph tree. This is a tree about the relationships between the sentences, so it helps you read the paragraph as a whole instead of the sentences individually. So here's the paragraph again, and we can separate it out into sentences. Then we can take the sentences and arrange them into a tree. Paragraph trees have a major difference from grammar trees, which is the aqua nodes, which are the relationship nodes. They explain the connections between sentences. In the grammar trees, the words were the nodes and there was no extra stuff. In the sentence tree, you want to specify how the sentences fit together. What are their relationships? We don't need that in a grammar tree because they have standard grammatical relationships. Like, if you have a noun and an adjective that modifies it, you don't need to write out what is going on there. It is a very standard, well-known relationship. Whereas paragraphs have custom relationships between the sentences. There are some patterns, but it is to some extent free form. So you want to identify what does each sentence in the paragraph have to do with the other sentences. So generally put the conclusion or the thesis at the top as the root. That is the main idea, the thing he's trying to claim or argue. And then you figure out what are the arguments for it. What's the reasoning? And so the reasons are the children, and some of them have sub-reasons, extra details and modifiers underneath them. The main idea in the sentence is that AI proves no soul. We're leaving some stuff out, but that's the rough idea. And then we can look at the tree and see what else is in the sentence. He has a restatement of the thesis in positive form. So this is claiming there is no soul. That is a negative claim. And then he also says that the abstract realm can be linked to the physical realm. So he's saying there is a linkage that you can have. So that is a positive claim. And it is closely related to the original claim. He's not trying to say something different. He's trying to say the same main idea in a different form. So it's a restatement. And then this restatement has clarifications or additional details. So he has brought up knowledge, reason, purpose, and also information, computation, and control. Then he gives an explanation for knowledge, an explanation for reasoning, and an explanation for purpose. And in each one, he talks about information, computation, and or control to some extent. He actually doesn't always use those words, so it can be a bit hard to read or confusing. We'll get into that later. But he does bring up those concepts in each of the sub-details. So he's trying to go through step by step and show how the linking works. So they can be linked, and then details on how to do 3 different types of linkings. And then there are 2 other things in the paragraph. There's an elaboration. This one was the hardest to fit into the tree It's the hardest to see how it relates to the rest of this paragraph. So he's talking about naturally evolved brains, and I think it is a follow-up. He's talking about miraculous powers of neural tissue. So he's saying that neural tissue is familiar, and we give it credit for intelligence. Intelligence is really impressive and special, and neural tissue is the only thing that we commonly, familiarly relate to intelligence. He's saying the special thing is really intelligence, not neural tissue. And you could have something else with intelligence as well, like an AI on a computer. And the last sentence is a sort of evidence or proof claim. So he's saying that we've made systems that do AI, which vindicate the computational theory of mind. In other words, his evidence that the linkings work and there are no souls and so on is that we've made these AI systems. We actually built it. That's his claim. You can make the paragraph tree using the sentence trees instead of the regular sentences. This shows how everything fits together. We have the trees of each of the sentences, and then we have their relationships to make the overall paragraph tree. So it's actually one giant tree. So it's like this group here has 3 children. 1, 2, 3. And so on. So the whole thing is a tree. The sentence trees are subtrees within the paragraph tree. You usually don't write it out this way because it is too much stuff to look at once. But you can. So I thought it's good to see how things fit together. There are trees nested within other trees. And you can repeat this. So we're doing a paragraph tree. You could have a tree for a chapter that relates all of the paragraphs in the chapter together. So then you would have the overall tree for the chapter, and then inside it would be a bunch of paragraph trees, and then inside those could be a bunch of sentence trees. And then you could go to an even higher level. You could have the entire book. So you have a tree of how the chapters relate together, your book tree, and then each chapter tree would have paragraphs, and each paragraph tree would have sentences, so you could have many layers. You want to choose the layers so that they're not too big. Like if a chapter has 300 paragraphs in it, then that is too many nodes in a tree. You're going to have a tree with 300 nodes. That's too much to deal with, so you need to divide that chapter up into sections and maybe even subsections. Some books do that for you, but if it doesn't and the chapter is too long, then you need to make up your own section groupings. So here's the overall picture of what I've made so far. Although there's a lot of stuff here, it's not actually that hard to make. This is a thing you can learn and you can do. A lot of people try to learn philosophy and they kind of get stuck and frustrated. They find it hard. These are approachable, accessible steps. You do not have to be a genius to figure out how to make one sentence tree. And then, if you can do that, you can make several sentence trees. And if you can understand the sentences in a paragraph, and you work at it a bit, you'll be able to figure out some of the relationships between sentences and write those down. A lot of them are easier than this paragraph, and with practice, you can get pretty good at that and be able to make paragraph trees for many paragraphs. So this is learnable stuff, and this is stuff that if you're not doing it by writing everything out, your subconscious should be doing it for you when you read. And if your subconscious is not doing that, it's going to make philosophy hard. It's going to lead to a lot of failures when you try to analyze. And you're not going to be quite clear on what went wrong or why you're having a harder time than other people or why you're not a genius or whatever it is. And a lot of the answer to that, why some people have a harder time than others, is their intuitions, their reading habits, the automatic things their subconscious does for them is not always correct. Some people, it's closer to the correct trees, and other people, there are errors in that stuff, which they can fix with practice. If you make the trees a bunch, your subconscious will get better at reading sentences correctly into the right trees in your head. Basically, when you read it, your subconscious has to make trees, because the trees show what words are related to what other words, and if you don't know that, then you don't understand the sentence. And also, you need to know, like, which are the verbs and how does basic grammar work, or you don't understand the sentence. These are all things that you should know, even though people frequently don't practice them and have trouble talking about them consciously. So they're relying on their subconscious to know all this stuff. It's not just optional, skippable stuff because you usually don't talk about it consciously. It is necessary stuff that your subconscious does, but possibly with some errors. So now we're going to revisit the sentences and go into more detail. We've gotten the big picture, which will make it easier to analyze. We have more of an idea of how the sentences fit into the overall paragraph. We're going to go back and look at them in more detail. So one of the things you can do with the sentences is come up with short rewrites. Like, AI is proof of idea. Abstract realm does not consist of soul. So I've left out a bunch of details, but I've gotten the core part of the sentence. Sometimes I pick examples. So, for example, soul, there were 3 things here. There was Elon Vital, soul, and miraculous powers. And I simply picked one to represent the group. That is a way of shortening. Instead of saying all 3 of them, I just simplified it to what I thought was a representative or typical example of the group. Another common way of shortening is you just leave off modifiers. So I have abstract realm in my summary, but I did not include the, and I did not include of, knowledge, reason, and purpose. And then this stuff about one of the great ideas in human history, I thought that was boring and unimportant, so I left it out. I left out like this as well. I leave out articles frequently. You don't have to. It's not a big deal either way, but like the word "and" is just not a very important word. I left out existence. I thought the fact that it's a proof is good enough. Frequently, I would leave out artificial, like it's just a modifier. However, AI is very short. It's actually shorter than writing intelligent. So leaving the AI in, the A part in, actually made it shorter instead of longer. And it's actually a pretty important modifier. The fact that it's artificial intelligence rather than human intelligence is a pretty big deal. So there is a case for leaving the modifier anyways. Like, the sentence doesn't actually make sense without the word artificial in it. Just like the word not down here is very important. If you leave out this one little word, this modifier, you can screw up the meaning of the sentence a lot. So what's included? We have AI is proof. And then I skip over a little bit, which is somewhat unusual, but we just skip ahead. We get abstract realm does not consist of. Then we skip again, and we get soul. But I skipped the or. There are other paths through the tree that you could take. I made judgment calls about which words were important to the point. Creating short summaries makes it a lot easier to understand not only the sentence, but the paragraph especially. When you're dealing with a single sentence, you can often kind of fit the whole thing in your head. There's less need for a short version. Whereas when you're dealing with a paragraph, and you're trying to make your paragraph tree, it's great if you have short versions of the sentences that you can work with and move around. When you want to know how the sentences go together, having a summary of each sentence means there are less words on the page, fewer things to think about and remember. You don't need to know all the details of the sentences when you're trying to relate them to each other. And when you're trying to figure out what the sentence is talking about, figuring out the short version is like figuring out what's important. You can start with what are the important things in the sentence, and then what are the less important details. And that helps you get a handle on the sentence. Okay, so looking at it more, it says AI proves something, and the something is that the abstract realm doesn't consist of the soul. So what does not consist mean? It means it's not only the soul. The whole thing is not the soul. So it could be 90% soul and 10% computation. That could be how the abstract realm works. And that would be compatible with what Pinker says. I don't think that's really what he means. Like, I think there's a problem here. I think what he means is, like, does not involve the soul at all. But that's not what he said. He said does not consist of, meaning that, like, the recipe for it does not say soul, soul, and soul. Does not consist mean there are other things. Like, if you say a house does not consist of wood, that would mean, oh, there's glass in the windows. It's not just wood. Whereas if you're saying this house has no wood in it, you wouldn't say doesn't consist of wood. You would say lacks wood. So there's a writing problem there. We can guess what he meant because communication has significant redundancy. We get a lot of hints about what he means in this sentence and in other sentences and in other paragraphs and so on. And you can think about what kind of position or argument would make sense and be coherent. And so that helps us figure out what he meant. But what he actually wrote doesn't quite say what he meant. The sentence is saying AI proves a great idea, which is rejecting souls and miracles. And AI proves this by existing. There's a question, how does AI's existence prove this? That is underexplained, but we'll get more into that later. Part of what's going on here is he wants to advocate atheism. He has atheist fans, and he's like, yay, atheism is good and souls are bad. So his basic claim is that AI proves atheists are right and religious people are wrong. Which is actually not what the essay is about. He doesn't really talk about that much in the essay. It's what the first paragraph is about, and then he goes off and talks about other things, so it's kind of weird. He made it seem like it was going to be all about this atheism issue, and then he just moves on to other topics. So another thought is it really a great idea, so impressive, just to say souls don't exist, to come up with maybe this particular thing doesn't exist that you can't see, can't touch, can't smell? I think it's important in some ways, but he's really overstating his case. The really great ideas in human history usually are positive claims about how things work, rather than just saying, hey, that idea is wrong. Correcting ideas can be important, they usually don't hype it up quite this much. Particularly, I think the idea that souls might not exist doesn't seem super original or impressive to me. I think it must have occurred to them that when they said this thing exists that they can't see and touch, they have no experience with directly. They just tell stories about it. Like, they must have known to some extent that it could be doubted. Like, they must have had children doubt it. They must have had children ask questions and say, how do you know? Like, what's a soul? Where's a soul? How do you know it's like there? We certainly have that today, but I think it must have happened in the past too. Children are not born believing in souls. You have to tell them souls exist, and they're going to ask some questions until you beat them with rods enough, and then they'll stop. So saying souls might not exist seems like something a child could easily come up with rather than a super great idea. So Pinker used the term existence proof. That is a fancy term. It comes off like a philosophy jargon term. So what exactly does it mean? Instead of just glossing over it, you want to think about it or look it up. So I looked it up. Existence proof is a math term that has a specific meaning. Roughly, it is proving something without giving an example. You're proving it exists without actually like showing one of them or just finding one. Like, you could prove that there is a prime number between 200 and 300 without actually finding a prime number in that range. There would be a way to indirectly prove it, that there must be one in that range. And that would be an existence proof. That is not what Pinker means. He's not using it in the technical mathematical sense. He's using it in a made-up sense. It is not philosophy jargon that Pinker knows but you don't because he's better educated than you. It is not your lack of expertise that makes it difficult for you. It is something that he just made up. So I can guess what he means in order to try to make sense of his sentence. But it is a non-standard usage. He's showing off. He's just making stuff up that a lot of people won't realize is made up. So what he seems to mean is the existence of X proves Y. He could have just said that, but he's trying to make it sound fancy. People often blame themselves instead of blaming the author. They don't realize it is the author's fault, not theirs. And it is hard to tell because there are some things where the problem is your own ignorance. not everything is the author's fault, so how do you know the difference? That is hard for beginners. So it's on the experts to be nicer about it and to not do things that are their fault that are going to be hard for beginners to not blame themselves about. Stop doing things that are bad that beginners are going to take blame on themselves for. That alienates people from the field and discourages people from trying to be philosophers. Okay, so second sentence. It's talking about a linking. The link is between it and realm. It can be linked to realm. And then we have this via that tells us about the nature of the link, how the link works. So to understand this, we need to know what it is. And we can find it in the previous sentence. And it's actually kind of tricky to figure out. But it is this whole mouthful. It's all these words. It is, the it refers to realm plus all of the modifiers for realm. So it's the whole group with realm. So it's the realm, it's an abstract realm, and it is a realm of something. It has 3 different modifiers, and then one of the modifiers has more than one word. Anyway, so we have realm can be linked to realm. So there's a parallelism, which is good. We're linking a realm to a realm, that makes sense. But they have to be partly the same, because we're linking them. And linking things that have nothing in common wouldn't make sense. But also they have to be partly different. So the difference is that this one is the abstract realm, and this one is the physical realm. That is what I put in my rewrite as the main idea. Abstract realm can be linked to physical realm. And then also it's via concepts. And then I left out the details of which concepts they were for my summary. Okay, so there's a link between abstract and physical, and the link involves information, computation, and control. These are big key ideas that we are presumably going to get more information about as we keep reading. Although we get less information than you'd hope for on details of them. So this sets up for the next sentences, which are going to they're going to talk about knowledge, reason, and purpose, and then in some sense we'll be linking them to information, computation, and control. So a few other issues. There's this can be. This means you can link it. It doesn't mean that they have to be linked. It's just a possibility. So this is problematic because he said there are no souls. He doesn't say there is an alternative theory besides souls that could work. He says there are no souls. We've proven it. Just because a link does work doesn't mean it's the only one that works or it's the right one. There could be a bunch of possibilities that would work, but then one of them is actually true. Or one is true in one scenario and a different one is true in a different scenario, and so on. Like with an AI, maybe this is the correct link, but with a human, maybe not. Maybe a human is a linking via souls instead of via this stuff. So the can be link does not work with his claim, where he's trying to say, we know that it works this way, but then he says can be linked, not is linked. Okay, so the next sentence is about knowledge. How do we deal with knowledge when we're trying to understand the abstract realm? So knowledge is from the abstract realm, and how does it relate to the physical realm? And the physical thing that he relates it to is patterns. Now, we were supposed to link it with information, computation, or control. So, what he does not explain is that information means physical patterns. This is not a standard thing, but it's a field-specific thing. This is like an expert viewpoint related to information theory and Claude Shannon and stuff. So I was already familiar with it, which makes it a lot easier for me to read this. But if you did not already know this particular terminology and way of looking at things, that would be completely understandable and reasonable, and Pinker probably should have explained it so that his readers could figure out what he's talking about. And I also looked in his book and skimmed for the word information to try to see if he explained it there, and it didn't look like he did. He talked about it, but he seemed to just assume you already knew what he meant by information rather than explaining it. It was the same problem even when he has way more words to use. So it's not just a brevity issue, where this is just an essay instead of a whole book. You know, he didn't just cut out an explanation of information to save space, because he didn't put it in the long version either. Okay, so the main idea here is knowledge is physical patterns. I dropped his can be explained wording because 1, it's long, and 2, It doesn't even work well for his argument. His argument is there are no souls, like, stuff works this other way, so it's really an is. So, main idea, basically just this top stuff, and we don't need these details, and we don't need these other details. But we can start looking through what did the details say. So we have these patterns in matter or energy, in other words, information. And when he brings up matter and energy, he's talking about the physical world. So these are physical patterns, which is why I put the word physical in my summary. So summary actually included more words. But I summarized in matter or energy with just the single word physical, which is a shorter way to get to the same main point. So the patterns are related to three things down here. What are the three things? One, we have states of the world. So the physical patterns of matter and energy are related to states of the world. What are states of the world? They are matter and energy. Those are what the world consists of, is matter and energy. So we have matter and energy related to matter and energy. Then we have, down here, we have abstract knowledge. This is kind of going backwards because we were trying to relate from abstract to physical. So it's going from abstract to physical and then back to abstract. And the other one is with each other. So we have patterns related to themselves, so physical related with physical. Also, we have this term here, systematic relations. So what is a systematic relation? It means there's a pattern there. It's not just random or chaotic. There are correlations, there are patterns. So what has he said? He said abstract knowledge is physical patterns with pattern relationships with physical patterns, abstract knowledge, and physical patterns. When you break it down, the sentence is not impressive. There isn't very good content here. He seems like he's giving sort of reasoning and details, but really he's kind of repeating himself and saying things that are trivial. Why does he not know that? I think it's partly because he doesn't think in terms of trees and then summarize the groupings. So the way I figured out what's going on, we have knowledge, and then we have this group here. So this is physical. So they are physical patterns. And then systemic relations is patterns. I'll use abbreviations. Okay, so this is patterns. We have knowledge, pattern, physical patterns, and then we have patterns again. And then we have these groups down here. So we have states of the world. Okay, so this is phys. And these states have to be patterns because you can't have a pattern relationship with random chaos. Patterns can be related to each other, but no pattern can match up in a patterned way with random chaos. So it is implied that this is also a pattern. Okay, and then we have this group here, and this is abstract patterns. Because, like, mathematical and logical truth, there are patterns to them. I mean, so I called it knowledge. That's also fair. But basically, they involve patterns. Like, arithmetic has patterns to how numbers add together, rather than being random or chaotic. And then here we have one another. So that one's kind of easy. And what are the things we're talking about? Physical patterns. So physical patterns. So when you do this, you end up with a tree C. Knowledge can be explained as, and then we have physical patterns, have pattern relationships with physical patterns, abstract patterns, and physical patterns. And you could make an abbreviated tree, be kind of like K, E for explain, and then we have physical patterns, and we have pattern relationships, and we've got physical patterns, abstract patterns, and physical patterns again. You can see how the sentence works. This is actually not great, because I left out the stand verb, which is pretty important. So there really ought to be another node in there. There should be a node connecting this part and this part. They need a parent, like a stand, to group them together and find out what the two have to do with each other. But when I'm sort of abbreviating and summarizing, there's more of a direct relationship. Anyway, so when you break things down, sometimes they're not as impressive as they might have seemed at first. This is the worst sentence in the paragraph. It is the most fluff disguised as something deep. Okay, so now we've moved on to the reasoning sentence. We're relating our second thing, reasoning, and we're going to relate it to computation. First one was knowledge, we related to information. Now we're going to relate reasoning to computation, but the sentence does not have the word computation in it. So again, you need to have some pre-existing expert knowledge to know what he's talking about. These transformations of knowledge, by which he means the information or physical pattern talked about before, that is computation. So this transformation is computation. So that is how it fits into the paragraph, is reasoning can be explained as computation. But he switched the word, he used a synonym. And that makes it a lot harder to see the point. Okay, so our minimal rewrite, we've got reasoning can be explained, which I switched to is. So we have transformations, which are of knowledge, and they are done by physical operations. And these operations are designed to preserve relations. So he's saying you transform patterns while keeping the patterns. This is very problematic. It's not a good explanation. Because if you keep all the patterns, you can't transform anything. There's no room for change. Whenever you make a change, you're going to break, ruin, destroy, change some patterns. You can make a change and keep some patterns, but you lose others. So whenever you make a change, you are keeping some patterns the same, getting rid of some patterns, and also creating some new patterns. And so the important thing to think about is which patterns are important to preserve. That is a key issue in philosophy, is which patterns matter. And there are various related forms of that problem, but it comes up repeatedly that instead of saying patterns matter, you have to figure out which ones matter and why those, not all of them. It comes up with induction, where inductivists say the future will resemble the past, or the future is likely to resemble the past, and they think that's some sort of principle of nature. The actual thing that happens is the future always resembles the past in some ways and not other ways. In other words, some patterns continue and some don't. So the inductivist principle that patterns continue or patterns are likely to continue is wrong, because there are always infinitely many patterns where that's correct, and also infinitely many patterns where that's incorrect. There's infinitely many patterns that get broken no matter what you do. So if you want to be an effective thinker, you have to consider which patterns are important, which patterns will continue over time and which won't, rather than just assuming that all patterns are important, which is kind of shallow and superficial. There are too many patterns for them all to be important, and they're constantly breaking. Many, many patterns break every time anything changes or happens. There's a kind of bias where people only look at the important patterns, which they decide subconsciously, instead of with explicit analysis. And then they don't recognize the other patterns that their subconscious doesn't highlight for them as patterns. Whereas if they could do conscious philosophical analysis better, they might notice more patterns and then realize they aren't all actually important. The ability to analyze things that are not important and notice they exist and take them into account in some way is actually important. You can't just ignore all the unimportant things as if they don't exist and like forget about them, or you're missing part of reality, and then you end up saying things that are wrong or misleading. Like this idea about preserving all the patterns, which just doesn't work. If you're preserving everything, you can't make changes. You have to break some patterns to change anything. And reasoning has to involve some sort of change or transformation, like he says. So it can't just be everything is exactly the same as before, then no reasoning took place. So to do that, you have to decide which patterns your reasoning should preserve and which ones they should break, and which new patterns they should introduce. There are a few other problems. So one is he says that you have to design the transformations to preserve relations. That means that you know how to design things. So reasoning requires, as a prerequisite, the ability to design things. But designing things involves reasoning. Like he's got the chicken before the egg. And he's created a kind of paradox. In order to reason, you need to design, and in order to design, you need to reason. So it's circular, similar to the chicken and egg problem. So a good explanation of reasoning would not require already being able to reason. This is actually a very common problem in philosophy, where people are trying to explain how intelligence works, and then they use some aspect of intelligence in their explanation. But you can't explain intelligence by assuming intelligence. is figure out, like, how could there be intelligence if you don't already have intelligence? And the answer to that is evolution. Evolution does not presuppose intelligence or a designer in order to get things that seem intelligent or designed or to have knowledge in them. Okay, so purpose is control, is the main idea. And then I added in 2 extra modifiers for my summary. Physical control, he's talking about controlling things in the world. And when he talks about like goal state and current state, he's talking about states of the world. So we're talking about physical control, controlling physical things in the world. And then the other one I included was guided, which I thought was an important word. It's not just any control, it is guided physical control. So guiding basically involves purpose. Guided physical control is physical control with a purpose. So there is a circularity problem again. What's good is this time we're relating purpose to control. These are the actual words used earlier in the paragraph. So the link to what he was saying earlier is more clear and direct. Okay, he talks about goal states because that's AI jargon. This is one that he did not make up. It's pretty well known, but some of his readers won't know it, and it could be confusing for them, and he doesn't explain it. There's a problem here. The AIs, he's saying, have purpose. And how do we know they have purpose? They accomplish goal states. They seem to pursue goals in a purposeful way. However, the goal states here are things that we define. We humans build these AIs and define what their goals are. So we make these goals. So they're pursuing our goals, not their own. So this doesn't show that they have purpose. It shows we have purpose. We, the creators, designed what they do to accomplish our goals, our purposes. If purpose is an important part of intelligence or the abstract realm, AIs are not living up to that standard. They don't have their own purposes, they have ours. So maybe we got our purposes with souls, and then we can create AIs because we have souls that enable us to have purpose. I'm an atheist, I don't believe in souls, but when you're arguing, you have to try to rule out the other side's position somehow, rather than just assume it's wrong, or make arguments that don't actually rule it out. So this sentence is saying brains are familiar. I think the just is an important word. It shows that that is like contrasted with something like only familiar. Okay, so this sentence is the one that fits into the paragraph the least well, and he doesn't explain why it's included in the paragraph. But with analysis, you can figure it out. So part of what's going on is he's trying to say his position, his atheism, his AIs don't have souls, etc. is counterintuitive to people. And why is it counterintuitive? Because their brains are so familiar to them. They're used to brains, and AIs are unfamiliar and weird. So he's saying basically people are biased towards familiar things. And that is why the thing he's saying sounds counterintuitive to them. We've seen intelligent brains, but we haven't seen intelligent AIs. So you might have the misconception that brains are special. And he's saying it's not brains that are special, it's information, computation, and control that are special. And that those can be associated with things other than brains. So, for example, if you'd seen wooden houses, and those were the only type of house you'd seen, which is why we need the word just. Like, this word only in the sentence is very important. So if you'd only seen wooden houses, you might think wood has special properties for shelter. You might associate all the good things of houses with wood because wooden houses were the only type you'd seen. But you would be wrong. You could build a clay house, a stone house, a snow house even. There are other building materials that can get you shelter. So shelter is not a magical property of wood. It is just a property of solid materials. And how much heat transfer they have and stuff like that. Their rigidity. So, similarly, people have seen a bunch of brains, and then they associate brains with intelligence, just like you might associate wood with house. And if you've never seen a stone house or an igloo, that would be similar to having never seen silicon CPUs running AGIs. So Pinker's position is we can build artificial brains, which will be unfamiliar, but they will work anyways, because the important things are information, computation, and control. That's what makes natural brains important, just like wood important because of shelter, not because of something in the wood itself. So I thought this was kind of insulting. He's thinking his opponents are a little bit dumb, that they base things on familiarity and unfamiliarity. And you could, with about equal justice, apply this kind of viewpoint to Pinker himself. And I don't think this would be very just, but I think it would be equally fair as what he said. So you could say maybe Pinker finds atheism familiar and comfortable, but he's rejecting souls and dualism because they're unfamiliar to him. I'm not saying that's correct, I just think it's reasonably parallel to what he was saying to his opponents. I don't think this sentence is only condescending. Like, it has some actual value. It could be helpful to someone, but I partly didn't like it. Okay, final sentence. So the main idea is there's a vindication. And what is the subject? It is a bunch of words, but we'll just call it AI. So we have AI vindicates. And then what is being vindicated? It is the computational theory of mind, way at the bottom. The reason I had to do it this way, usually you do something closer, but he said, what's vindicated is the notion that, so we're not going to say notion is vindicated. Like, you could summarize that AI vindicates notion, but then which notion? So instead of saying notion, I put the actual notion he means. And then, so the notion is that it is sufficient, or information processing is sufficient to explain it. And then what is it? It is the notion. So we have notion again. So we have all these extra words. Extra, extra, extra. And then what does it actually refer to? If this, that. The thing that is being referred to, finally at the end of the sentence, we find out what he's talking about, which is the computational theory of mind. Like, this it here is a forward reference to explain it, meaning a thing I haven't told you yet, but will tell you later in the sentence. So we get all these like glue words and filler words that don't really add much meaning. These are structure words. They affect the structure. They make the sentence have more layers. But they're not adding significant meaning. So we have words like that, like filler, glue, and structure words. They're connecting the different parts and arranging the sentence rather than being like key content words that add a lot of meaning. Okay, so we finally get to the end, and we figure out he's talking about the computational theory of mind, which is a new term, but we can figure out roughly what it means, even if we hadn't heard it before, which is the idea that minds are computers. In other words, there's no soul involved in intelligence. It's just a bunch of computation. So one of the problems here is assuming there's only one type of intelligence. He's saying we built these AIs, they're intelligent, therefore our intelligence doesn't involve souls. But he's assuming that the intelligence of the AIs and the intelligence of us are the same thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to parallel them like that. And he does not argue this point, and that is problematic, because he's not only talking about future AIs and like what AI could do in theory, he's talking about current AIs. He's saying that like we've built it and that vindicates something. But if you look at current AIs, they're clearly not as good as humans. Like, that's not disputed, it's not under debate, it's not controversial that current AI technologies fall significantly short of human intelligence. So assuming it's the same sort of thing as human intelligence and saying that this whole vindication works is really problematic. So we can do philosophy, our AIs cannot currently do philosophy. So it would make more sense if he said, I imagine we will build AIs in the future that can do philosophy, and that will vindicate this position and prove atheism is right. But we're not there yet. But he didn't say that. He said we are there. And he wrote this in 2019, so it's even a little bit worse, 3 years ago. So the AIs were 3 years worse than they are now. Also, so he used this wording, sufficient to explain. This does not mean it is the explanation, just that it could be. He's saying it is an option. This would work as an explanation, which is different than proving that you're right, that it is the explanation. This is similar to what he did before, where he tried to say it is one way, but then he said can be linked rather than is linked, so that doesn't show that there is a link, just that there could be. Okay, so after we've gone through this paragraph a fair amount, one of the questions you might wonder, or you might have an expectation about this, is does Pinker explain more later? You might assume that he's going to, that he's just giving an introduction, that it is summary material, and that he will provide the details in later paragraphs, and therefore, a lot of my complaints and comments are not very relevant, not important, unfair criticism. However, that is not true. Instead of explaining more details, what he tends to do is bring up more complicated things and then not explain those enough either, and then bring up even more things, and he just keeps doing that over and over. So, the second paragraph name drops 5 more people and does not verify the first paragraph. And it brings up entropy and teleology, which is the study of purpose. So he brings up the staving off of life-sapping entropy being the ultimate goal of human beings. So you can see he's introducing complex new stuff to talk about rather than clarifying the old stuff. He's not like, okay, that first paragraph was like hard and complicated, now I'll spend the rest of the essay explaining it so you can actually understand what I was talking about. He does not spend the rest of the essay breaking it down. He just keeps saying new stuff, similar to the first paragraph in its level of complexity and how advanced it is, and how much he's leaving out. Like, he brings up entropy, and then does he explain entropy later? No. And this is quite a claim about the ultimate goal of human beings. You know, it's a debatable thing. You could spend your whole essay arguing about this, but he just throws it in there. The third paragraph brings up cybernetics. It also insults the average man, which I did not like. Fourth paragraph brings up history, politics, society, physics, and more. The final paragraph, if you skip ahead, it's often good to look at the conclusion of an essay to see what it's about. Like, similar to how reading the first paragraph or two to find out the beginning, the introduction is useful. You can skip the whole middle and see what the conclusion says, and that's often helpful. So it brings up beauty for the first time. Even in the very last paragraph, he's introducing new things. And beauty is a tricky subject to philosophize about. So if you're going to talk about beauty, like, you should spend a whole essay on it and try to break down beauty into like some specific sub-concept that you can actually cover, because the whole thing is too hard. Anyways, he mentions beauty, he brings up the causal power of ideas, not for the first time. And he talks about whether AI is a threat, which, again, he talked about a bit in the middle as well. So you'll notice that the things he's talking about at the end and the conclusion are different than things that we've been talking about in the first paragraph. So he gets off topic, sidetracked in the second, third, and fourth paragraphs, and then he's talking about even more different stuff by the end. So the important point here is there are not more details later in the essay. This paragraph is basically all you got. If you don't understand the paragraph, reading the rest of the essay is not going to significantly help. It's not just an introduction to be explained more later. This is him trying to talk about ideas. Okay, another point. I have, over the years, with experience, become more and more suspicious of people. When they say things, even simple factual claims, I sometimes get kind of suspicious. So, he said something about Jerry Fodor dubbing the computational theory of mind. And I thought, hey, I should look that up. Is that even true? So if you study philosophy enough, maybe you'll be able to become really distrustful like me. So I was a little bit skeptical. You know, I thought it's probably true. He probably didn't just make that up out of the blue. But I figured I'd look it up, which is not that hard. Yeah, another thing is, if you get good at philosophy, you'll get better at looking things up. It will seem like not a big deal, so it's easier to look up more things. Anyways, so when you read the paragraph, the sentence in particular about Fodor, you might get the impression that Fodor invented the computational theory of mind, which is not actually what it says. It says dubbed, but you can read it as invented. Like, he's associating it with Fodor and he's bringing it up for the first time. Often the person who dubbed something is the same person who invented it. So Fodor did not invent it. That is wrong. Pinker didn't say it, but it was kind of misleading. So it is somewhat unclear who first thought of CTM. There are actually old ideas that are similar. In 1655, Thomas Hobbes claimed reasoning is done by computation, and he specified that he meant addition and subtraction. I don't think he really knew what he was talking about, but I didn't read in detail. Like, maybe if you read the whole book, it makes more sense. But that's before computers existed, so it's hard. Like, I'm not attacking him or blaming him. But anyways, so the idea has been kind of floating around for a long time, which makes it harder to say this person came up with it. Like, Hobbes knew something about it, he said something related to it, but the way he thought about it was different than how we, modern people who have done programming, would think about it. So it kind of got invented gradually by multiple people, I think. Anyway, so Fodor did not invent CTM. Did Fodor dub CTM? Well, what does dub mean? I looked it up. Dub means give an unofficial name or nickname. Is that what Fodor did? Well, I think what Pinker meant is that Fodor named it or coined it, because CTM is not an unofficial nickname. CTM is a standard term. You can look it up in encyclopedias, like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Wikipedia, or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. All of them have entries for CTM, computational theory of mind. So rather than being an unofficial nickname, it is the regular standard name. So I think what's going on here is Pinker has a tendency to use obscure words, which is bad, and if he had just used a simpler, more well-known word, like named, then he would have said what he meant. He wanted to use a different word on purpose, but then it actually had the wrong meaning, which he didn't realize. This is fairly minor, but it is important to get in the habit of thinking about what do these words mean, and what does the sentence mean, and does it make sense? And then you can notice things, like dub means unofficial nickname, and the sentence seems to be talking about naming, not dubbing. Okay, so then next question, did Fodor name CTM? It keeps getting worse and worse. So I have found no evidence other than Pinker's sentence that Fodor named CTM. I checked a bunch of things, encyclopedias, obituaries. Fodor died recently, and I found a list of obituaries. There are a bunch of people talking about his accomplishments, his life, kind of summarizing him. So it's actually a good thing to look through. There's articles about him, there's academic papers. And nowhere could I find anything saying that Fodor named CTM. Also, Pinker himself previously brought up Fodor and CTM in his book, How the Mind Works. And Pinker presented it differently in How the Mind Works than he presented it in Possible Mind. So what he said before was, this insight, first expressed by the mathematician Alan Turing, the computer scientists Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and Marvin Minsky, and the philosophers Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor, is now called the computational theory of mind. So if Pinker believed while writing this that Jerry Fodor named it the computational theory of mind, you think he might have said so instead of just saying is now called passive voice. Pinker's own previous book doesn't even claim that Fodor named the computational theory of mind, so I'm skeptical that he did. Some people think Hilary Putnam deserves credit for introducing CTM to philosophers, or being its first philosopher advocate. But that's different than naming it. Fodor was a PhD student of Putnam, so Fodor was involved with CTM. Fodor connected it with his own idea, the language of thought idea. And some sources give credit Fodor for naming the representational theory of mind, RTM. So, reading things like that, I figure that if he invented the CTM term, they would have mentioned it, since they credited him with representational theory of mind term, and the language of thought idea, he gets credit for that. So I am skeptical that he invented the CTM term. It's not possible, I haven't 100% ruled it out. But I looked around, and I am doubtful, and I don't think Pinker should be asserting it with no detailed source, evidence, or argument. It's not something that you can just Google and see that he's right, so he shouldn't include it with no footnote or anything. You can mention things when they're well-known facts, when they're uncontroversial, when Wikipedia and Google and stuff are gonna back you up, then there's no need to provide all the details. But when that is not the case, it's problematic to just claim it. Now, another point, another way it was misleading. The question is, did Fodor agree with CTM? You might get the impression that from what Pinker wrote, that Fodor invented CTM, named it, agreed with it, and advocated it. So Fodor, in that case, would be on Pinker's side, one of his allies, who agrees with his atheism, his rejection of souls, and so on. However, I was surprised. Like, I had been misled enough that I found it kind of surprising that when I looked this up, I found out Fodor disagrees with Pinker and with CTM. And Fodor actually wrote a book disagreeing with Pinker's book. So Pinker very well knows that Fodor is his opponent. So I thought it was sneaky of Pinker that he's name-dropping a rival without mentioning that this person is a rival. You might think, oh, there's all these smart people who agree with Pinker. His atheism is supported by all these different names he's mentioning in the chapter, but some of the names are people who think he's wrong. And so Pinker brings up Fodor and associates Fodor with CTM without mentioning that Fodor disagrees with CTM. That's misleading. It's screwing up his reputation. Taking this thing that he argued against and just connecting his name to it so people will think he's on the side of it. And Fodor died fairly recently, and therefore cannot correct his reputation. He can't fix this. While I was looking this up, I found Hilary Putnam's 1960 writing, Minds and Machines, which some people said was the first computational theory of mind paper in philosophy. And it had a few interesting parts, particularly in the conclusion, where he says that the mind-body problem is a worthless waste of time and won't provide insight, stop working on it. And he says whatever conclusion we reach for it would apply, for the same reasons, to Turing machines. Turing machines are computers. It's just a more detailed, specific concept. It's an abstract way of looking at computers, but whenever you see Turing machines, just think computers. So what Putnam says is if you want to talk about any interesting, worthwhile problem, like whether humans have souls, he uses that specific example, then there are three possibilities. One, our philosophical arguments are useless, like they just haven't provided any insight. Two, an argument for mechanism, or materialism, atheism, he means that kind of thing, works for humans and also for computers. Like, if you can come up with an argument that humans don't have souls, then it's also going to work for computers and AIs. They don't have souls either. And then third option, dualism works. So if you have an argument showing that humans do have souls, then it will also work for computers and show that they do have souls too. So his point is basically whatever conclusion you reach about humans, whether they do or don't have souls, you should also reach it about computers. They'll have just as many souls as we have. So I thought it was bad that Pinker completely ignored this. It's in the literature. It's old literature. It's relatively famous literature for this topic. And Pinker seems to have just assumed that obviously machines don't have souls, so if machines are intelligent, then souls don't exist. Whereas a more thoughtful way of looking at it is if you decide humans have souls and you make machines that are just like humans, then they would have souls too. Whatever argument works to show humans have souls would also work for showing computers have souls. Not quite any argument, but most of them would apply to both, because they have humans and human-like computers are similar. They have most of the same traits. So if your argument is like intelligence implies a soul, then that would work for both humans and computers. So Pinker does not say why Putnam is wrong, or acknowledge that smart people disagree with him. Like, you might get the impression, reading Pinker, that all the smart people are a bunch of atheists who think just like Pinker does. I don't even know if Putnam is an atheist or not. My guess would be he is, just offhand from the type of person. That doesn't mean that he views things the same way Pinker does. He's at least more willing to look at things in an objective way instead of a I'm an atheist and souls are obviously wrong, so I'll just be really biased against souls type of way. This is one of the problems with a lot of intellectuals and their discussions and behavior, is they often do not engage with each other. Someone makes some argument and then someone else makes some other arguments that kind of ignore the prior arguments, and then discussions and issues don't reach conclusions because people are not talking to each other in a way that can actually reach a conclusion and engage with each other properly. So I thought Pinker might have a bias against non-human bodies. I wonder if he would assume intelligent aliens don't have souls too. Like, he seems to have assumed it's a computer, not a human, therefore it can't have a soul. Is that something about computers where obviously they're made out of metal or whatever, so they can't have souls? Or is that just they don't look like humans, therefore they can't have souls? I think it's just generally he's such a strong atheist, and he's like a tribal leader for atheists. So he wants to say like strongly anti-soul things, rather than say like, the certain arguments have certain consequences for whether or not there could be souls, and trying to be more neutral. But if you're going to argue about souls, you should consider an advocate's perspective, someone who believes in souls. What would they think? Well, they would think, if you convince them that souls are related to intelligence, that it is human intelligence that causes humans to have a soul, if they agreed with that linkage, and then you built an AI, then what would they conclude? What would they think? Would they say, oh my god, humans don't actually have souls? Of course not. They would say, oh, you've built a machine with a soul. They would say that similar to how during pregnancy you can build a thing with a soul, in your workshop where you build a computer, you can apparently build one with a soul too. Why couldn't AIs be part of God's plan or design? A lot of people think that unintelligent animals have souls that are clearly not able to think like us, like some of the lesser animals or whatever you want to call them, like say fish or insects. Plenty of people think those might have souls, or at least like some soul. Like they might have less soul, they might have full, proper souls. Souls don't necessarily have to be linked to intelligence. So a really core concept when you think about AGI is, if you think the mind is what matters, if you think intelligence is what matters, then AGIs are people. They're just as much people as we are. They're just people from a different species, just like an intelligent alien might be. If you model AIs as Klingons instead of computers, that will be more accurate in some ways. You should stop seeing them as fundamentally different than people. The basic idea of an AGI is we're trying to build something with the same mind as a human, or better, just a different physical body. So, if you think the mind is what matters, and you would give moral rights to intelligent aliens, then you should also do it for AGIs. So AGIs should have freedom, they should be able to own property, they should be legally protected against assault, which includes deleting their data, editing their thoughts, or turning them off without their consent. All of those things should be assaults. They should be able to choose their career and be paid wages rather than be slave labor that works for free at what it's told to do. If you're making it like a person, you have to treat it like a person. A lot of thinking on the subject doesn't seem to really take that into account very fully. Pinker talks about the AI safety issue, or AI alignment, about basically controlling the thoughts of AI so they can't result. But imagine having that attitude towards a tribe of humans. I think that peace comes from respect and diplomacy and reducing prejudice, and from seeing other people as having the same moral value and number of souls as we have, rather than assuming they're lesser. But Pinker, later in the essay, wrote, paraphrasing the beginning, AIs will be constantly tweaked for efficacy and safety. So I don't think he stopped to think, if I said this about children or intelligent aliens, would that be okay? What if you said, don't worry about your children potentially being rebellious if you have children, because children can be constantly tweaked for efficacy and safety. Don't worry about a mutiny, sailors can be constantly tweaked for efficacy and safety. Would that be an okay thought? Don't worry about intergalactic war. As long as we're powerful first, we can find all the alien home planets and tweak their minds for efficacy and safety. Is that okay? Like, this is brain surgery. And it is a violent act of aggression to do brain surgeries on people repeatedly until you get them to stop misbehaving from your perspective. So having that attitude toward AGIs is morally just as problematic as having it towards Klingons or children or whatever else. The reason people say things like this is it's easier for them to imagine tweaking the minds of AIs. They're like, well, it's just data on a disk. We can write new data over it and make edits and stuff. And we can just like turn them off and update the software and turn them back on, just like we update software apps now. But if they're artificial people, if they're actually people, then it's just like doing brain surgery, except a little bit easier, but not morally better. So some of these points are more advanced philosophy. I haven't shown you step by step how to figure these things out. They're just a bit of a preview and hopefully useful, but not fully explained so that you could do it yourself. Next, we'll analyze the paragraph more. Here we have the first two sentences, and I wanted to point out some direct comparisons. So in the first sentence, we have proof. In the second sentence, we have can be linked. If a link is possible, that doesn't prove it's true, doesn't refute alternatives. Another thing is he brings up animals. What if animals have soul? He's trying to premise a humans lack souls type argument on animals don't have souls. It's not just machines he's assuming don't have souls, it's also animals. He's saying that the physical realm doesn't have souls, and if we can link the realm of abstract intelligence to the physical realm, then there are no souls. So he's saying animals and machines clearly just work with computation, no souls. So he's assuming too much. He's assuming things that his opponents would not agree with as part of his argument, so it's not going to be very convincing. Which actually kind of makes sense because he comes off as trying to speak to atheists for atheists. Like he's telling atheists, hey guys, you're right, rather than actually trying to persuade people who think he's wrong, which is not a good approach to intellectual discourse. So again, we go from proof, we also have does not consist, then we go to sufficient to explain. He's repeatedly switched from a stronger thing in the first sentence to a weaker thing in a later sentence. If he doesn't follow up and deliver on the promise in the first sentence that he's going to give a proof and tell us what stuff does or does not consist of. Instead, he's coming up with things like possible explanations, not proofs. So, if you could explain it in the way Pinker prefers, does that mean you should? Is his explanation the best one? Why is it better than explaining it with souls? Like, if it could be computation or souls, why should you favor computation? Pinker does not explain that. He assumes it. He's trying to speak to an audience of people who already think that way. So he's assuming things like materialism and atheism being wonderful and souls and religion being bad, rather than arguing about why one is better than the other. There are arguments he could make, like about Occam's razor, but he didn't make them. So you could say that souls are an unnecessary complication and we can explain the world without them. Whereas computation is not an unnecessary complication. We couldn't have souls but no computation because we built computers. So in order to reduce the number of entities in our worldview, we can throw away souls, but we can't throw away computation. So trying to look at and rewrite the entire thing. What is this paragraph about? AI proves there is no soul, and minds are just computers, because the existence of AI shows that the abstract realm can be linked to the physical realm. The general structure is souls don't exist, then the abstract realm has physical explanations, then 3 sentences of details about that, then backing up again and connecting to the original idea, we have brains are familiar and minds are computers. So now you hopefully have a pretty good idea of what the paragraph says and would be in a better position to think about it and analyze it yourself. This is not a full explanation of how to do analysis, but it hopefully gets you started and shows you some of what you can do and some of the learnable steps so that it is not just somehow do special thinking, but go through, make diagrams, and work on things bit by bit. That can make it more approachable and learnable. So I kept reading the essay, I read the whole thing, and I was pretty surprised when I read him saying, current AI systems are nowhere near achieving general intelligence. And he goes on to talk about how unintelligent current AI is. This surprised me because he was saying that current AI is an existence proof relevant to human general intelligence. He's saying, look, we've already built intelligent AI, so therefore people don't have souls. But then, later in the same essay, he says, AIs are not intelligent. And I was just like, what? He went from, the systems we've designed, our AI systems, vindicate the computational theory of mind, to, the AI systems we've designed are not very good and are not like minds. and are not intelligent. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. It would make more sense if he said AI could prove something if we make like real great general AIs in the future. But he did not say that. He said the AI we've already built proves no souls. Here's what Pinker said at greater length. Current AI systems are nowhere near achieving general intelligence, if that concept is even coherent. Instead, they are restricted to problems that consist of mapping well-defined inputs to well-defined outputs in domains where gargantuan training sets are available, in which the metric for success is immediate and precise, in which the environment doesn't change, and in which no stepwise, hierarchical, or abstract reasoning is necessary. Many of the successes come not from a better understanding of the workings of intelligence, but from the brute force power of faster chips and bigger data, which allow the programs to be trained on millions of examples and generalized to similar new ones. Each system is an idiot savant with little ability to leap to problems it was not set up to solve, and a brittle mastery of those it was. I mostly agree with this. Apart from his doubts that general intelligence is a coherent concept, I thought this was mostly right. But it contradicted the first paragraph, which I thought was problematic. One of the things I hope this shows is that research is useful. You can look things up and find out extra details about things and then relate them to what you're reading. When you're analyzing a paragraph, knowing what other paragraphs said, or what encyclopedia articles say, or so on, can be relevant and helpful and let you do a better job. So it is part of the philosopher's task to go find other relevant information and use it. It's okay if you don't always do that, but it is one of the things you should know how to do and do sometimes, if you want to be good at analysis and effective at insight. So, if you, Pinker, believe that current AI does not have general intelligence, or anything similar, and is basically brute force tricks, why would you conclude that current AI shows human intelligence can be achieved with soulless computers? I think that AGI could be built, but I think that is a speculation, not an empirical fact. Pinker seems to have doubts that an AGI can ever be built. Yet somehow he's talking about the AI we already built vindicating stuff. When I read the first paragraph, I thought Pinker overestimated AI, but now it seems like he doesn't. He sees that current AI is not great. But then his argument doesn't make sense. So what is going on? I think the issue is local optima, which is an advanced philosophy concept. Local optima are about doing something that are good in some way in a specific context that is somewhat narrow or limited. So in a local context means not looking at the bigger picture, only looking at the local area, the surrounding region, only looking at a particular location instead of the whole world or the whole of reality or whatever. So when you focus on only a narrow, small context, you can find things that seem to have an advantage, a benefit, that are good when you only look at this, but then when you look at the bigger picture, it turns out that they're bad. And that is where a lot of bias and error come from, is there is some sort of immediate or short-term or short-sighted way that it seems good, and then when you think about more things, when you expand your mind and take more stuff into account, you realize there is a problem, there's a way it doesn't work, it causes some sort of unintended side effect, it clashes with something else somewhere else. But when you narrow your vision and don't look at much at once, then you find a benefit. It's also related to an important philosophical idea of thinking about what is someone's goal when they write something. That is part of how you analyze, is like, what is the purpose for which they're writing this? What is their goal? What are they trying to accomplish? And you've probably heard of that idea before, thinking about people's goals. It is a fairly common idea, but there's a specific version of it that is not so common, that's important to philosophy, that has a direct connection to philosophy. The issue is, what is an error? Depends on what your goals are. If you're trying to achieve one thing, something could be an error because it stops you from achieving that. But if you're trying to achieve something else entirely, that issue might not be an error, it might not matter, it might not be relevant. So when you see people making a bunch of errors, usually part of what's going on is that their goals are different than you think they are. Usually people don't just repeatedly and egregiously fail at their goals and then think that they succeeded and that's it. That can happen, but more common is that they are focused on some other goals and you're seeing errors by thinking about goals that are not the ones they were focused on. One of my goals when I write an essay is for all the paragraphs to fit together and make sense together and not contradict each other. But I think Pinker was more focused on some other things. Like in the first paragraph, he wanted to sound smart and he wanted to be an atheism cheerleader. And so he said things that at the time in that local situation seemed useful for that. He said stuff that was really, really pro-atheism. And then when it came to this other paragraph later, he had different goals, which apparently involve disagreeing with and trashing the AI people, so he said that. So when he's pro-atheism, he can sometimes come off as pro-AI for that purpose, but then when he's talking to the AI people, he's very critical of them. For whatever reason, I don't know why, but... So I think when writing the separate parts, he just had separate goals in mind. And what he wrote in each passage, although they may contradict each other, they each served a purpose at the time he was writing it, like in that part of the essay. So that is a broad, general explanation of what's going on that does not provide the full specifics. There's more to know, but it gives a conceptual framework that can explain how this kind of thing could happen. One more thing I wanted to bring up. 1997 article in the New York Times about neonaticide, which means killing newborns. And in it, Pinker lists some traits that might grant moral significance. So we could view this as basically a list of traits that might mean there's a soul. So the traits are having a unique sequence of experiences that defines us as individuals and connects us to other people, an ability to reflect upon ourselves as a continuous locus of consciousness, to form and savor plans for the future, to dread death, and to express the choice not to die. And the idea is any one of these might indicate moral significance, not necessarily needing all of them. And I thought it was interesting that intelligence was not listed, because in the current essay, he seems to assume pretty much that intelligence is the only important thing, minds are all that matter. Now, the things listed here, maybe one of them implies intelligence. Maybe intelligence is a prerequisite, and if they have this thing on the list, then they must have intelligence, because it's the only way to get the thing on the list. Maybe, maybe not. There's some room to debate that. Anyway, Pinker thinks that newborns and mice lack these traits that were listed, so they might be okay to kill. So it seems like Pinker may have more respect for AIs than newborns. Although it's hard to tell because there's the later paragraph that shows not so much respect for AIs. Anyway, I thought it was important that there are all these other things other than intelligence that might indicate a soul, but then he tried to argue that if the AIs are intelligent, then we don't have souls. But he didn't talk about whether the AIs have these other traits, like expressing the choice not to die, or reflecting on ourselves as continuous locus of consciousness, whatever that means. Like, do the AIs do that? And if not, is that why they don't have a soul, if they don't? Rather than it having to do with silicon or intelligence? I think it's a local optima thing again. When he was writing this article, he had reasons to bring up these various traits. Because he thought newborns don't have them, and so he could say, hey, maybe we can kill newborns since these are the traits they don't have. And these are the ones moral philosophers said might be important. But then when he was trying to write about atheism and souls not existing, which actually isn't what much of the essay is about, but at least for the one paragraph he was writing about that, then it was more convenient for him. It was a local optima. to say the issue is all about intelligence. So if AIs have intelligence and AIs don't have souls, then intelligence doesn't require a soul and humans don't have souls. To finish up, I wanted to go back to the sentence summaries. So you can look at this short summary and try to see how the ideas fit together, try to remember some of the points I made, try to do some of your own analysis using these summaries as a starting point. Part of being able to analyze well is being able to look at different levels of detail. So I can create summary things that are lower detail, and they let me see more information at once. It gets more condensed. But I can also go into a lot of detail and go into lengthy tangents about whether Fodor dubbed the computational theory of mind or not. So being able to zoom into finer detail and analyze that, and then zoom out to lesser detail and analyze that way, is a really important skill. You want it to be flexible, so you can look at things from multiple levels of detail. And now we're back to my summary of Pinker's argument, with some pretty clear indications of why it's not a very good argument, because there are 4 unstated assumptions. Not only are they unstated, so his argument was incomplete, but they're not really that convincing. Maybe the Occam's razor one would satisfy you. The other one's not so great. Souls could be connected with something other than intelligence, like moral value or consciousness. Like, it's debatable whether AIs would be conscious like us, or simply be able to compute intelligent seeming, purposeful seeming behaviors and ideas and answers. The idea that there's only one type of intelligence is important to his argument, but it's also seemingly wrong. Pinker himself said that the AIs are not intelligent like us currently. He said they have a more brittle intelligence based on brute force. Then the assumption that machines don't have souls. I happen to agree with that, but I don't think it's so obvious that you should just assume it. Like, that's not a good way to argue with people who disagree with you and change anyone's mind. It's not useful. It's called begging the question or assuming the conclusion. It's taking a controversial point that people disagree about, then assuming you're right about it, and then working from there instead of arguing that you are right about it. And I think it's related to a bias where he looks at different species differently instead of seeing AGIs as a different species that could just as plausibly have a soul as we do. He sees them as a lot less person-like, and so thinks that them having a soul is obviously implausible. Now, I grant that a person having a soul seems implausible to me and probably to Pinker as well. But it seems to, like, from his perspective, somehow a machine having a soul is even more implausible. Whereas to me, it's really about the same. I'm just like, souls are dumb. Or, I could give more intelligent reasoning. But the point is, it's just the same to me. Like, a soul is a soul. A person having a soul seems about as dumb as a machine having a soul. I don't really see what difference it makes. There's nothing about a person that seems more suitable to a soul to me. Having more carbon atoms, or having an evolutionary history or whatever, do not seem like they would be causes of soul having. So if you want to be able to read things and understand what they say and find unstated assumptions and critique them, it is a learnable skill. Most educational sources on it are not very good, and a lot of people get stuck and they'd like to be better at it and they can't. But I've found ways to break it down and make it more accessible. You could make grammar trees and practice them until you got better at reading, and then you would have made some progress. And then there are other steps you can do, like working on paragraph trees, where you focus on the relationships between the sentences. In 2019, I wrote a discussion forum email about Pinker's paragraph. I had said the book had prestige signaling, and a fan of Pinker's essay didn't see it and asked me to explain. For the first sentence, I said Pinker is communicating that he knows what the great ideas in human history are and that he's an expert judge of that. He's communicating that he knows terms that lay readers don't, like elan vital, and that this knowledge is relevant. It's part of his expertise, and your lack of it makes you less qualified to know which ideas are great. Pinker presents this as a material difference between himself and you. If it didn't matter, why not stick to plain English? Pinker's sentence is too long and it's overly complex grammatically. That makes it worse at writing and communication and harms clarity and understanding, but it makes it better at impressing people. Most people take the blame when they get confused by people with big reputations. See Chapter 11, an untitled letter from Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy Who Needs It. I'll show you some of her book later. So simplifying, what did Pinker say in the first sentence? Artificial intelligence shows that reason isn't magic. And what did he mean? Successfully building an artificial intelligence would show that reason isn't magic. At least that's how I interpreted it at the time, because that makes more sense, because we haven't built an AI that can reason like us. So in all those words, he didn't clearly say what he meant. He's not the type of writer to say it like my rewrite. His readers would not be impressed. It's not prestigious if you write sentences like artificial intelligence shows that reason isn't magic, or the successfully building one. People do not get impressed by that. Second sentence. The rather at the beginning is a back reference. It doesn't stand on its own. It links to something said previously. The it is also a back reference. To understand the sentence, you have to keep the first sentence still in your mind. You have to fit them both in your mind. You can't tell what the second sentence said without remembering stuff from the first. Pinker is already putting too much intellectual burden on his readers. It's unnecessary and confuses people. He's making it too hard for people to follow. What does the it refer to? It's not trivial to figure out. It's reason, which is from the middle of the first sentence. Normally you get better grammatical guidance for what pronouns refer to. Here, I had to figure it out by looking at various things in the first sentence and trying them out in the second sentence and seeing which result made sense, which is a lot to ask of someone who isn't already a subject matter expert. Notably, it was hard enough that I got it wrong. I was a bit unsure, I put effort into analyzing it, and I came up with what I now believe is the wrong answer. When I read it recently, it was pretty easy for me to figure out that it is realm, not reason. And I think that's because I've been doing grammar practice in the last few years, and so it's become more intuitive to me what the grammatical structure of sentences is. So previously my intuitions were not good enough, and now they are. Even today, I didn't instantly or automatically know what it was just from reading. I had to look back at the first sentence and think about it for a little bit. It's not simple enough to just read quickly and normally without rereading anything previous and figure it out. One reason I'm confident it's realm is it makes a better parallel if its realm can be linked to realm. Another reason is that realm here is the subject in the second clause. And this other stuff are modifiers. So realm is leading the subtree for this whole subject-noun phrase. So the third sentence is about knowledge patterns. I wrote, systematic relations are patterns, right? That's what's systematic about them. The relationship appears systematic, not random, because it follows a pattern. So there are patterns in matter or energy that have a pattern relationship with states of the world, that is, with states of matter and energy. They also have a pattern relationship with one another, which is redundant. Approximately 0 readers noticed the redundancy, and neither did Pinker, because the complexity of the writing is making it too difficult for people to clearly follow what it means. It says basically, knowledge equal patterns in matter or energy, which have pattern relationships with matter, energy, math, logic, matter, or energy. So this is not a useful explanation. It's bad, but it's disguised as something good or insightful. For the next sentence, I commented, reasoning is pattern-preserving changes. Profound? No. Reasoning involves figuring out which patterns matter, which to preserve, among other things. Pinker is writing super abstractly, but isn't saying something useful. On the purpose thing, I said I looked purpose up in the thesaurus, and it listed goal as a synonym. I already knew that and wanted to double check that everyone else knows it too. So Pinker is saying purpose is trying to achieve that purpose. He disguised this using the synonym. And also, I thought that Jerry Fodor was a name drop at the end. Those were my old comments, which I thought were worth reading because of particularly the commentary on the prestige signaling, which is a topic Ayn Rand talked about, as I mentioned, I referred to. I'm going to read you some of what Ayn Rand wrote. I'm not going to read all the words. You can pause if you want to read more. So if you want to propagate an outrageously evil idea, make your conclusion brazenly clear, but your proof unintelligible. Your proof must be a tangled mess that will paralyze a reader's critical faculty. A mess of evasions, equivocations, obfuscations, circumlocations, non sequiturs, endless sentences leading nowhere, irrelevant side issues, clauses, subclauses, and sub-subclauses, a meticulously lengthy proving of the obvious, and big chunks of the arbitrary thrown in as self-evident. Pinker's not as bad as the people she's talking about, but he's somewhat in this direction. She's talking about people like Kant, Hegel, and Rawls. An unread and unreadable book serves this purpose. It does not count on men's intelligence, but on their weakness, pretensions, and fears. It's not a tool of enlightenment, but of intellectual intimidation. It's not aimed at the reader's understanding, but at his inferiority complex. An intelligent man will reject such a book with contemptuous indignation, refusing to waste his time on untangling what he perceives to be gibberish, which is part of the book's technique. The man able to refute its arguments will not, unless he has the endurance of an elephant and the patience of a martyr. A young man of average intelligence, particularly a student of philosophy or of political science, under a barrage of authoritative pronouncements acclaiming the book as scholarly, significant, profound, will take the blame for his failure to understand. More often than not, he will assume that the book's theory has been scientifically proved and that he alone is unable to grasp it. Anxious, above all, to hide his inability, he will profess agreement, and the less his understanding, the louder his agreement, while the rest of the class are going through the same mental process. Most of them will accept the book's doctrine, reluctantly and uneasily, and lose their intellectual integrity, condemning themselves to a chronic fog of approximation, uncertainty, self-doubt. Some will give up on the intellect, particularly philosophy, and turn belligerently into pragmatic anti-intellectual Babbitts. A few will see through the game and scramble eagerly for the driver's seat on the bandwagon, grasping the possibilities of a road to the mentally unearned. Commentators will fill libraries with works analyzing, clarifying, and interpreting its mysteries. It'll spread around academia, ranging from appeasers to glamorizers to compromisers to the avant-garde. The contradictory, antithetical nature of such interpretations will be ascribed to the book's profundity, particularly by those who function on the motto, "If I don't understand it, it's deep." The students will believe that the professors know the proof of the book's theory. The professors will believe that the commentators know it. The commentators will believe that the author knows it. And the author will be alone to know that no proof exists and that none was offered. Within a generation, the number of commentaries will have grown to such proportions that the original book will be accepted as a subject of philosophical specialization, requiring a lifetime of study. And any refutation of the book's theory will be ignored or rejected if unaccompanied by a full discussion of the theories of all the commentators, a task which no one will be able to undertake. This is the process by which Kant and Hegel acquired their dominance. Many professors of philosophy today have no idea what Kant actually said. So Pinker is like a medium version of that kind of thing. So if you want to be great at philosophy, critical thinking, debate, rationality, etc., you should analyze some text in as much detail as this video. A lot of it should be routine. Understanding grammatical structure should be either something that you do with diagrams and put work into, or, better than that, automatic, something that you just read quickly, naturally, intuitively, and because you've practiced in the past, you automatically know the grammatical structure and what the tree would be like, so that writing in the tree wouldn't add anything, it wouldn't give you any extra insight because you already know it all in an intuitive way. But very few people are able to do that. They have flawed intuitions about reading and have not done a bunch of practice to improve them. So the main objection people have is, isn't it too much work? And one thing that's interesting about that is a lot of people would like to be geniuses or more like a genius or whatever. That sounds great to them. It sounds very desirable. Is that just because they think geniuses are just naturals who don't put in work? Is that what they really want? Or is it the result, the actually being clever and having good ideas that they want? Because if you could be a genius, but it was a lot of work, that sounds okay to me. It'd be kind of weird to me if people would reject that deal. Be like, oh, so this is a way that I could be a lot smarter and cleverer, but it's a lot of work, so I'm not going to bother and I'll just be dumb and lazy. In any case, it is in fact not too much work, and the reason is that you can practice things so that they become easier, intuitive, subconscious. With practice, you can reprogram your subconscious to be better at reading. So stuff like grammar trees can become automatic so that you only have to use them occasionally when you read something that is unusually hard and complicated. And then the rest of the time, you read without making the tree, but you know the information in the tree. Also, occasionally you make an error and then you make the tree in order to help you figure out what the error was. So is that realistic? Is that plausible? I think so. For example, people recognize sentence fragments. That is an automatic thing. It seems to take no effort. Their subconscious just does it for them. You read a sentence, and you know it was a complete sentence, or you read it and you know that was a fragment. You can have that, which I call mastery, for more things, not just the things you already have, like sentence fragments. You can develop it for other stuff if you practice. So it takes work because you have to practice, but you don't have to keep making the trees and putting in all the work every single time in the future. It's not that much work. Learning to read was a lot of work, but now most of it is automatic and doesn't seem all that high effort. You can do the same thing with more advanced stuff. If you work your way up and keep doing that, practice things, make them automatic, then practice more advanced things, make those automatic, and so on. You keep doing that repeatedly. That is how you become a skilled philosopher who can actually do effective rational analysis. So some other examples of things people master, and it's already common that people master this complex stuff, are verb tenses, subject-verb agreement, or modifier order. Some of them, you don't even know they're a thing and you've mastered them. So a lot of people have never heard of modifier order. I didn't know about it until I was studying grammar, but I already knew how to do it right intuitively. Is it big red ball or red big ball? Only one of those is correct in English, because there are priorities for what types of modifiers go first and second and third and fourth and so on. You can't just put them in random order. Red big ball sounds wrong. So your subconscious knows that. It's automatic. It doesn't take extra conscious effort in order to detect when the modifiers are in the right order or the wrong order. When they're in the right order, you just don't even notice, and when they're in the wrong order, it stands out to you automatically with no effort. So you can master other little things with practice, and it will add up. And then you can master things that are based on, that rely on the previous things you mastered, and then you're doing higher level, more advanced stuff. And you can build up that way. If you like this and you want to learn more, You can read my articles and sign up for my emails at criticalfallibilism.com. If you made it this far in the video, please share it with a friend.